Hi everyone, so this is going to be the first in a series of videos which will support your understanding of Macbeth. And today's session or today's video is going to be a look at the context and an overview of the text. So I'm going to talk you through a couple of the key elements with regards to context and make sure you just have a firm understanding about the whole text and really its purpose before we even get into looking at the acts individually. The two key things to really know, first and foremost, are the monarchs that Shakespeare was writing around, or the time of the monarchs that he was writing around. He wrote across two monarchs, Elizabeth I and James I. Now Macbeth falls under the latter of James I, and we call this the Jacobean era. And even within that, there are two key things I really want you to know about the context of James I and his reign. First and foremost, he was a Catholic and Scottish king. So he was somewhat disliked, and in fact he had an intense fear of assassination. And you might well know about the gunpowder plot and Guy Fawkes Night. It's technically what we celebrate on the 5th of November. It was an assassination attempt on James I. So he was immensely afraid of being killed, and he had pretty good reason to be so. So he feared regicide. Okay, now regicide is the act of killing a king. So first and foremost, that influenced much of Shakespeare's writing in Macbeth. He wanted to create a play that in some respects is almost a propaganda play, because it's trying to tell the people of James's lands that basically you cannot come and do this without consequence. You cannot try and assassinate a king without consequence. Now in the text, Macbeth kills Duncan, the rightful king, and the consequences for Macbeth and his wife are grave. They eventually spiral out of control, they lose their minds, their psyche becomes fragmented and deteriorated, and they both lose their lives at the end before things eventually return to normal with Duncan's son being crowned king. So basically it acts as a warning. Anyone who tries to commit regicide or does, they will face dire consequences. The second thing that James was also intensely afraid of, and in fact he had an intense phobia of, was witches and the supernatural. And you might have heard the term or the phrase, someone has written the book on this. It's usually a phrase we use to suggest that someone is knowledgeable on something. Well, James I literally wrote the book on witches. He wrote a book called Demonology, and this book itself was published with the intention of educating his public about the danger of the supernatural, of black magic and witches. And it was also trying to serve a purpose where he wanted to tighten legislation around how witches are convicted and the punishment of witches at the time. So it's really important that when you're reading Macbeth, although today we think of witches sometimes as almost kind of comical figures, with their stereotypical hooked nose and scraggly hair and standing around a potion and turning it over and over. In those days when this was first written, witches were deemed very real and a very present threat to people. So the witches in the play would have been very terrifying to the audience, and they would have thought that these kind of characters could be amongst them because they feared witches to be real. And James I wanted Macbeth to write a play, wanted Shakespeare to write a play basically about that, to try and make sure that the populace, his people, were as aware of the dangers of the supernatural and of witches as he was. In terms of the context, those are the two key things that really Macbeth is written in some ways as a propagandist piece to serve the interests of James I, who was a patron of Shakespeare, and basically to say, firstly, you cannot try to attack the king and not have consequences. You cannot upset the natural order of things, the divine right of kings, or the great chain of being. These are two terms that we'll come to later as well. You cannot upset this and not expect there to be consequences. And the second thing is, do not align yourself or become embroiled with the supernatural or witches, because there will also be consequences. Those are the key elements of context to support your understanding of the text. In our next videos, we're going to be starting to look at the acts individually, starting of course with Act 1. Thanks.